topic that's very close to the heart of Bruegel here. All the structural issues of reviving Europe's economic growth is very important for us. And the role that zombie firms or productivity lagging firms actually plays is a very important part of our creative destruction potential in Europe here. We've been working on that in Bruegel already since a long time too. For instance, in the last blueprint that we did on the future of manufacturing, there was also, we have two contributions that particularly focus on this problem of Europe of how to deal with creative destruction here. For instance, Carlo, but we will talk about that later, I guess, already identified how important in the whole adoption of digital technologies, how important these lagging firms are and continuing lagging firms here. Also, we have another chapter that really deals with how much Europe is characterized by static firms that fail to grow here. So it's both in terms of growing and entry as well as exit that this creative destruction part of Europe is actually failing here. So we're very happy to have today here work that the OECD has done on this being presented, because the OECD has really done a very great work on this already also since a longer time on these productivity growth differentials here. And the study that they are going to present today is really very important cross-country, cross-sector analysis of zombie firms and how that actually affects the overall productivity. And it will also allow to compare Europe with also other countries as well, and zoom in on the different countries within Europe here. I'm not going to take too much time here. I think it's high time to leave the floor for presenting the study here. We have the two authors here, Dan Andrews and Giuseppe Nicoletti. But you will be presenting. No, you will be presenting. Okay.
I will start, yeah. But just let me start by saying that well, first of all, thank very much Bruegel to host this event and give us the opportunity to illustrate the results. Second thing I would say is that I am just supervising this work, but the real authors are, three of them are here, you know, Dan, Valentin, and Philippos, and there are two more authors, you know, in Paris. So this has been a great team. They have been working a lot on productivity since a long time, and the latest result of this work is this project that we are presenting today, which is focusing on exit policies. And if I get this to work, yes. So the occasion here is to this policy paper that comes up today, and that summarizes different technical background papers that have to do with looking at the role of exit policies for productivity growth. You know, that's the paper. But this is just a synthesis paper, and behind this there are several more technical papers. So my role here is that I will try to give some kind of motivation and you know, early overview of the project, and then Dan will get into the details. So I mean, it's not. I think it's not a mystery for everyone that there is a big problem with productivity globally. There's a productivity slowdown going on, and then the slowdown started before the crisis with declining multi-factor productivity. This is, of course, the OECD average, but you can observe similar patterns in many OECD countries. Then this was kind of followed by a collapse in investment and, you know, the capital deepening in many OECD countries, which is still, you know, and both the lower rate of growth of MFP and of investment and the lower rate investment are still going on many years after the crisis. So these are dragging down labor productivity, and many people around the globe have been scratching their heads of why this is happening, and to what extent are structural factors at play, to what extent policies can do something about it. One contribution of the OECD in this area has been to, and I must say that we follow in this the steps of Carlo Altomonte, who was one of the first ones to point out that just looking at averages doesn't really, help very much to understand the causes of productivity weaknesses, and doesn't help either understanding the possible remedies. So we've been increasingly using firm-level data to look at this issue. And when you do that, one of the main results we found was that there's an increasing dispersion in productivity within countries. And especially there is an increasing gap building up between those firms that continue to grow and are at the frontier, the global frontier, and the firms that are lagging behind. So, and this kind of pattern is quite common across countries, not in every country, but in many countries. So when you look at this figure, what is striking is that it's not so much the fact that frontier firms are growing much faster than in the past, but it's more like the fact that laggard firms are not catching up. So the three stylized facts that emerge from this firm-level analysis is that you've seen the rising dispersion in productivity, but also we see that the best firms are, have always, it's always harder for the best firms to be able to grow. So, there is kind of a problem in reallocation of resources from the weakest firms towards firms that have higher productivity. You would expect in principle that, when productivity dispersion increases, then you would have more reallocation towards the highest productivity firms. And this is not the case, and this is a real conundrum. And then this goes along with a declining business dynamism. We see less entry rates in all countries, and especially, and this is the specific topic of this paper, we see an increasing burden of the weakest firms. Weakest firms, we call them zombie firms. They are firms that are defined in various ways, but the way we define them in this project is firms that are quite old and have not been able to cover their interest payments on their debt for a number of years. Now, if you look at the data, the striking fact is that the burden of these firms in OECD economies have been increasing, and to some extent it is normal that these firms, the burden of these firms increases during big crises. But what is less common is that this increase keeps persisting after the crisis. And also, as you can see, the curve there is the average productivity of these firms. So while these firms are increasing their share on the economy, their productivity is going down. So this is really a ball and chain that is kind of dragging down productivity in many countries, especially Southern European countries, in which you have these two factors: the fact that the productivity of these firms is going down, their share is going up, dragging down productivity growth. Now, of course, the questions there are: why are these firms, the share of these firms rising? Why is the share rising? And why aren't they just exiting markets or being restructured in an effective way so that they can kind of, from their status of zombies, resurrect somehow? The problem is that there's not much analysis on that, and one of the reasons for that is that So far, most of the research has been, focusing on entry conditions and not so much on exit conditions. I give here a sample of the many journal articles devoted to entry barriers, administrative burdens on startups, and so on. But quite relatively few researchers have focused on the exit side. So this is where the OECD contribution comes. And it's focused around three main points. The first one is to generate data in order to be able to compare across countries the conditions, the institutional conditions that may facilitate exit or restructuring of zombie firms. And this is, by focusing on a number of features of insolvency regimes that are relevant for either the ability of failed entrepreneurs to get back into business, or the ability of the insolvency regimes to promote a quick and relatively cheap way to restructure firms. So the second one is that we also identified a number of channels through which these zombies, the existence and the increasing share of zombie firms may affect aggregate productivity, which are not all obvious, as Dan will point out later. Some are direct, some are indirect. And then finally, we look at what is the scope for policy to remedy to this situation. So, of course, one of the clear areas in which it should focus is on solvency reform of insolvency regimes, something that the EU has looked at in 2016, and I think at the European level there are discussions in order to see how to implement the proposals by the Commission, and some countries have done some progress in that. But the originality, I think, of the work that was undertaken by the OECD team is also to look at to what extent these insolvency regimes are complementary to other measures. There's a clear complementarity with the banking system and banking reform. Then we'll explain why. But also other policies that are less obviously related to productivity and to zombies and so on. So with that, including policies that can smooth the costs, the social costs that are related with the exit of firms. Now, I will, without further delay, I will, hand over the floor to Dan, which will get into the real substantive issues.
Okay, thanks, Giuseppe, for that introduction, and thank you also for inviting us here. This is a great forum. So, what I'm going to do today is talk about two things. So, firstly, to give you some more insights into the problem, which Giuseppe briefly introduced, and secondly, is what can we do about it from the perspective of policymakers. So, the first conjecture of this project was that weak firms were stifling productivity growth and the increasing survival of these firms. And Giuseppe has already shown you some preliminary evidence where he documented the rise in the share of zombie firms on average across OECD countries, and the fact that they're surviving with increasingly diminished relative productivity. Now, when you dig deeper and look at the country level here, you see that these patterns are actually evident across a number of European countries as well. The blue bar shows the share of zombie firms, which is similar to what Giuseppe showed earlier. And we see that this has risen in many countries. But more importantly, we find that the share of productive resources sunk in zombie firms has also increased. So if you take Italy, for instance, the blue diamond shows that on the eve of the crisis, about 7% of the capital stock in Italy was sunk in zombie firms. By 2013, that figure had risen to about 19%. So this is a question that an issue that we dig deeper in. It turns out that that the resources sunk in these firms turn out to be of first order magnitude for understanding productivity weakness in OECD countries. And in a sense, a lot of this work has been inspired by the studies in Japan after the asset price bust in the early 1990s, which documented a similar rise in zombie firms, but more importantly, an increase in the capital stock sunk in these firms. So when we think about the consequences of this for aggregate productivity, when we delay the exit or restructuring of zombie firms in our economy, it can have harmful effects for productivity through a number of channels. So firstly, it can just simply drag down the average unweighted productivity in the economy. So there's more weak firms surviving. So on average, productivity is weaker regardless of the size of the firms. But more importantly, and this is the issue that we really focus on in this project, it stifles reallocation. So in a sense, when you're trapping valuable skills, labour, credit and capital in zombie firms, there's an opportunity cost to that. And what that means is it crowds out growth opportunities for more productive firms, which basically affects reallocation in the economy. And finally, there's an effect in terms of deterring entry. So in a sense, if you think that the survival of zombie firms congests markets, it suppresses profitability opportunities, then in a sense, you can think of that as being equivalent to entry barriers rising in the economy. So a firm that's considering entering now has to be more productive than otherwise to be able to cope with these more suppressed market conditions. So in a sense, what we do in this project is we mainly follow through proposition 2 here in terms of our empirical analysis, but we also find some evidence for 3 as well. And essentially what we do is we marshal cross-country harmonised firm-level data, and we try to understand what happens to healthy firms when they operate in industries where a larger proportion of the capital stock is sunk in zombie firms. And essentially what we sort of observe here are 2 consequences for potential growth. The first is that when a healthy firm operates in an industry where more capital is sunk in zombie firms, they tend to undertake less investment and hire fewer workers than otherwise. So, and the main result here is in terms of suppressing capital deepening in the economy, which Giuseppe mentioned as a key constraint on post-crisis potential growth. Now, the second proposition and the second finding is that whilst there's an effect on non-zombie firms on average, we find that it's actually the more productive firms that are most adversely affected here. So in a sense, what should happen in a well-functioning economy is that the most productive firms should be able to attract resources and grow to underpin their expansion. And that raises aggregate productivity through more efficient reallocation. And what we find is that in sectors where more of the capital stock is sunk in zombie firms, it's the firms of relatively higher multi-factor productivity growth that have problems expanding. This is also true for young firms as well. So let's dig a little deeper in terms of these mechanisms. So, and to think about how big these magnitudes are. So what we do here is a simulation in 2013 where we say what would happen to non-zombie business investment, so the business investment of healthy firms, if the zombie capital share was lowered to the minimum level in the sample. So what we see, for instance, in Italy, we're looking at a potential gain to business investment of around 2.5% in cross-sectional terms. An alternative counterfactual here is to ask what would have happened to business investment in Italy if the zombie capital share hadn't risen after the crisis. And basically our estimations there suggest that perhaps 1/3 of the weakness in post-crisis aggregate business investment in Italy could have been avoided if the zombie capital share hadn't increased. So, these estimates of the economic magnitude are non-trivial, to be sure. Now, the second thing we find is that there's also an effect on multi-factor productivity growth. And this essentially is consistent with the idea before where in a sense, when you trapped valuable capital in zombie firms, it becomes more difficult for more productive firms to grow. Now, I should mention here that this isn't the full economic impact. So what we're doing here is we're focusing on the effect of zombie congestion on the growth opportunities of healthier and more productive firms within narrowly defined sectors. So this is a purely within industry effect. Now, it's likely that these effects are bigger if you believe that capital can also flow across industries. As I mentioned before, we're also abstracting from the effects on unweighted productivity and also the effects on entry. Now, the question is, okay, how are these adverse effects of zombie congestion on aggregate growth realised? Now, when you go to the literature, there's two possible channels here. The first one is what I mentioned before. When you have more zombie firms persisting in the market, what happens is that they absorb valuable labour. They basically drive down prices and profitability opportunities. So, in a sense, market conditions just become less attractive for investment. The second channel is that basically, and Giuseppe mentioned the banking sector before, that in a sense, these zombie firms are being kept alive by banks. And in a sense, you can think of there being an opportunity cost from banks continuing to extend credit to zombie firms in terms of the foregone credit that could have gone to healthier firms. And this is some work that we've done with Philippos from the ECB, where essentially we link banks to zombie firms. And what we find is that essentially, when you look at, for instance, in sectors with a greater share of the capital stock sunk in zombie firms, you tend to find that healthy firms report greater difficulty accessing bank credit. So this is some type of evidence for the notion that the survival of zombie firms also undermines aggregate productivity growth through a misallocation of credit. So the big question is what to do. So we're going to focus on three main things today. The first is insolvency reform. And one of the reasons we're focusing on insolvency reform is that, in a sense, these type of regimes are crucial for firm exit and restructuring, since they can bring debtors and creditors to the table to try to resolve financial distress in an orderly fashion. Now, one of the things we argue in the paper is that there's a number of market failures that basically make the winding up of zombie firms difficult. And in a sense, this then has key implications for aggregate growth, not only through this reallocation channel, but also through a selection effect. So to the extent that basically insolvency regimes shape the cost of firm failure, that's also going to basically affect the types of entrepreneurs that choose to enter the economy, and also the type of innovation strategies that they have. Now, one of the big obstacles that we encountered when we began the study is that when you look at basically the literature on insolvency regimes and economic growth and productivity, one of the big limitations is that we don't have very good indicators of the design of insolvency regimes across countries. So this is starting to change now, which I'll talk about soon. But the typical indicator you'd use is something from the World Bank Doing Business, which tells you the number of days to close a business or the cost to close a business. And our research over the last 6 years or so would show a negative correlation between these indicators and productivity, which I think makes sense. The problem that we always encountered was when we went to capitals and spoke to policymakers, they would ask us, well, what do we do? And in a sense, the problem was these World Bank indicators don't really have any policy lever underlying them. So in a sense, this motivated an OECD policy questionnaire to member country governments to try get at the key design features of personal and corporate insolvency regimes that are relevant for productivity and growth. And in particular, we were interested in those design features that affected the timely initiation and also resolution of insolvency and restructuring procedures. So we talk about this more in the study, but this is a broad sort of analytical framework for how we think about this. The indicator, which is available on the website now, which has gone live, is structured around three main substantive blocks plus a miscellaneous block. The first one relates to basically personal insolvency regimes. So whilst we're looking at firm productivity and investment here, which is mainly a corporate insolvency thing, the design of personal insolvency regimes is still relevant, because we know that in many countries when entrepreneurs start a new business, they have to post personal collateral or guarantees. So in a sense, you have this situation where the design of the personal insolvency regime, which affects behaviour before firm incorporation, tends to come back and bite entrepreneurs later in case of failure. So one of the key metrics here is essentially the number of years to discharge. So what that means, for instance, is if Giuseppe starts a business and fails, if he was in Estonia, for instance, he would have to sit on the sidelines for 5 years before he could start a new business. If it was in the UK, however, it would only be 1 year. So you can imagine that as being relevant for productivity in terms of incentivising risk-taking. So in Estonia, for instance, Giuseppe might sort of enter with a much more cautious business strategy. In the UK, where failure is less heavily penalised, he might enter with a lot more radical business strategy. The second block talks about prevention and streamlining measures. Now, these are relatively new things. They essentially came out of the IMF Article 4 recommendations after the financial crisis in Europe. And these relate to the availability of out-of-court settlements, the extent to which there's early warning mechanisms. So are there online instruments where firms can actually try assess whether they're in distress? And most importantly for this study is the corporate restructuring block. So this entails about 5 main sub-indicators. I'll just mention briefly that one of the main indicators here is the ability of creditors to initiate a restructuring plan. So in only about 1/3 of OECD countries, in 1/3 of OECD countries, creditors cannot initiate a restructuring plan. So you can basically imagine a situation where you have a zombie firm that is in trouble, it probably needs to exit or somehow downsize. And in 1/3 of OECD countries, the creditors can't take early intervention to try to deal with that problem. There's a number of other indicators there that also matter. So just to fast forward here, what we do then is we construct cross-country policy indicators where we sum these 3 main blocks, and we end up with this indicator here, which is mainly for 2016 in terms of the bars. It's increasing in the extent to which the insolvency regime is likely to entail barriers to firm exit or barriers to corporate restructuring. And in a sense, one of the interesting things here is that there's widespread cross-country heterogeneity in the design of insolvency regimes. On the right-hand side, we have a number of countries where there's much scope to reform their insolvency regime. I mentioned the UK before on the left-hand side. That, based on our metric, that has the friendliest insolvency regime to restructuring in the OECD. The diamond then shows what was the state of play in 2010. So we see that there has been some reforms since 2010, and this particularly is related to the prevention and streamlining measures I mentioned before in Europe. There's also some action on the barriers to restructuring front. But in a sense, the personal cost of failures block really hasn't changed in a number of countries. So having sort of come up with these new indicators of insolvency regime design, we then try to demonstrate their relevance for understanding the 3 sources of contemporary weakness in OECD productivity that Giuseppe mentioned. And in a sense, our results suggest that essentially cross-country differences in the design of insolvency regimes are relevant for each of these factors. So the first main finding is that in countries with more stringent insolvency regimes, we tend to see a larger share of the capital stock sunk in zombie firms. And this comes about through 2 channels. Firstly, zombie firms are less likely to exit. But secondly, and more importantly, it's less likely that zombie firms or weak firms are rehabilitated and subsequently improve their productivity. And what that means is that, and that's significant because we know that there are social costs in terms of job churn from firm exits. So if an insolvency regime can basically affect aggregate productivity through restructuring and rehabilitation as opposed to firm exit, you can imagine those political economy costs being a lot lower. Secondly, it follows that if insolvency regimes affect the capital sunk in zombie firms, well then they should also have implications for the extent to which that capital flows to more productive firms. And that is also true. And finally, they also basically have important implications for the ability of laggard firms to catch up to the global frontier. So Giuseppe mentioned at the start of the presentation that one of the key micro dimensions of the productivity slowdown is this increasing dispersion between frontier and laggard firms. And one of the key explanations for that is that the forces of technological adoption or diffusion in OECD countries have broken down. So this is the final contribution of this work. So just to give you a sense of the magnitude of these effects, the first chart here shows the impact of reducing barriers to corporate restructuring on the zombie capital share in a number of countries. The blue bar is the impact of reducing the 2010 indicator to best practice. So for instance, in Greece, you could potentially get a reduction in the zombie capital share of about 9 percentage points. That's considerable and economically significant, given that the zombie capital share for the Greek economy is about 28%. The red diamonds then show, for instance, the extent to which reforms since 2010 have gone some way to alleviating this problem. So, for instance, in Greece, we estimate that the reforms since 2010 will likely lead to a reduction in the zombie capital share of about 5 percentage points. We then show in our empirical analysis that in countries with better insolvency regimes, you tend to see that capital flows more readily to more productive firms, which raises the efficiency of capital reallocation and multi-factor productivity growth. Again, there's some simulations there showing the gains to multi-factor productivity growth via improved capital reallocation of insolvency reform. And finally, this shows the impact of insolvency reform, particularly related to barriers to corporate restructuring, on the productivity catch-up of laggards to the global frontier. So, for instance, in Italy, a reform to their barriers to restructuring to the sample minimum could essentially improve laggard firm productivity by about 2.7 percentage points. When you dig deeper into the study, you'll notice that basically this is a differential effect between those firms that operate in sectors that are highly exposed to insolvency regimes. So these are firms that operate in sectors where there's lots of firm entry and exit relative to firms that enter in sectors with less creative destruction. So in a sense, the key mechanism behind this, we argue, is that, in a sense, when you adopt new technologies, you can't do this in isolation. It requires reconfigurations of workplaces, changes to business strategies, and more generally to organisations. And this is going to be a lot easier to do in countries where barriers to restructuring are lower. The other thing we find is that there's actually a complementarity between insolvency reform and other policies as well. And in particular, we find that insolvency reform can actually increase the bang for the buck of reductions in entry barriers. And there's more information in the appendix on this. So the second thing that we think is important here to address the zombie firm and misallocation issue is financial sector reform. And this is some work that we've done with the ECB where Philippos courageously matched banks to firms, which took probably 3 months to do. And essentially what we did here is we tried to study the links between zombie firms and banks depending on the health of the banks. And in a sense, what we find, once we sweep out a bunch of country-specific time-varying industry shocks, so for instance the effects of the business cycle, we find that basically zombie firms are much more likely to be connected to weak banks. And in a sense, we argue that this is some evidence to support the idea that zombie firms are being kept alive by bank forbearance in Europe. So this is the idea that when banks get into trouble, they're reluctant to basically write off these loans to zombie firms as non-performing, because if they did, they would actually have to raise fresh capital and they come up against their regulatory buffer, I should say. The second thing we do is we study the aggregate implications of this connection. And we find that in sectors where there's more weak banks, capital flows less readily to productive firms. And in a sense, Philippos and myself argue that maybe about 1/3 of the adverse impact of zombie congestion on capital misallocation can be accounted for by problems in the banking sector. Now, the key policy implication of this is that we need to do something about non-performing loans and particularly the capitalisation of banks. So I think most people would agree with that. Now, as it turns out, the effectiveness of basically these NPL resolution programs turn out to be conditioned by the insolvency regime of a country. So you can imagine in a country where there's significant barriers to corporate restructuring, banks are going to be a lot more reluctant to call in these loans to zombie firms because they know that it's going to take a long time to be able to get the money back, and they may never get the money back. So in a sense, they have an incentive to engage in forbearance and bet on the resurrection of these firms by hoping that the economic cycle picks up. This chart here shows, for instance, how a country's insolvency regimes conditions the impact of an improvement in bank health on the zombie firm share. So the first thing to note is that the UK is at the best practice of the insolvency reform here. So focus on Latvia or Estonia, for instance. If they were to basically reform their barriers to corporate restructuring to the UK level, what you would see is that an improvement in bank health could actually translate into a almost 3 percentage point greater reduction in the zombie firm share than otherwise. So in a sense, this points out a complementarity between initiatives to basically resolve NPLs and also insolvency reform. We then go a bit further and think more about the barriers, the financial sector barriers, I should say, to technological diffusion. And we study, for instance, the impact of different financial factors on the catch-up of laggard firms to the global frontier via more efficient technology adoption. And one of the key findings here is that investment in intangibles is crucial for productivity and particularly adoption. We know that that when firms basically want to adopt those cutting-edge ideas from the frontier, they need to do R&D themselves. They need to have decent managerial capability and so forth. And in a sense, when you think about the predominant mode of financing intangibles, this isn't through the banking sector. This tends to be more related to non-banking finance sources, particularly equity financing. So what we show here is we have a few pieces of evidence that shows the impacts of, for instance, on the left-hand side of increasing the size of the venture capital sector on productivity catch-up of laggards. And secondly, and more importantly, on the right-hand side, we show that the design of the corporate tax system is crucial. In almost all OECD countries, the corporate tax system favours debt financing over equity financing. And this mainly relates to the ability to basically deduct interest payments. And in a sense, what we show here is that there are significant gains for laggard firms to catch up by reducing the debt bias in the tax system, which would in turn encourage and also nurture greater sources of equity financing. So finally, what we've argued here is that basically a number of OECD countries need to do two main things to address this zombie firm problem. Firstly, insolvency reform, and secondly, coupled with financial sector reform. Now, we're confident that this will raise aggregate productivity growth, but one of the channels through which this will raise aggregate productivity growth is a greater churning of jobs and firms. So this then raises a number of political economy considerations. There are going to be social costs involved in this process. So the third thing we argue is that these insolvency and financial sector reform policies should be flanked by well-designed activation policies. And in a sense, what we show is we study the policy and structural factors that affect the time it takes for a worker who's displaced by firm exit to return to work. And one of the key findings here is that active labour market policies are crucial. So these relate to not only retraining programs, but also job placement services. And these tend to be much more successful in returning displaced workers to work than, say, passive measures such as long-lasting active unemployment benefits. We also show that policies that promote residential mobility are crucial. So this relates to the tax wedge, but also, for instance, the design of taxations of housing markets. So, for instance, transaction taxes and buying and selling properties. And finally, some key policy complementarities emerge. So we find that spending on these active labour market policies are much more effective in countries that have decent public sectors, so have efficient public sectors, so the money is allocated properly. But more importantly, in countries that actually have low entry barriers for new firms. So what we do here is we simulate the impact of increasing active labour market spending by 1/4 percentage point of GDP on the re-employment probability of a worker displaced by firm exit. So in countries that have low entry barriers, you're basically getting a 6% increase in the re-employment probability, whereas in countries of high entry barriers in product markets, you're looking at about half the effect. And in a sense, this is consistent with the idea that, and the literature that Giuseppe mentioned earlier, on the important effects of entry barriers, not only on productivity, but also on job creation. We know that young firms disproportionately drive job creation in a lot of OECD countries. So, in a sense, if you don't let those firms enter, you can't really expect an active labour market policy to be fully effective. So I'm going to leave it there. Here's a brief summary, which I think I've touched on a number of these things already. We think there's a strong case to revive productivity growth via basically policies that improve the efficiency of corporate restructuring. But it's crucial that these policies are basically flanked by well-designed active labour market policy. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is really an excellent piece of work that you're doing here. I also am very happy with the more positive note at the end that, yes, we can revive productivity growth here, but at least we know now way better how to deal with here. Now, that means that our discussant really has a hard job to try to come up with comments here, but I think Carlo, you are the best placed since you also have worked on this issue very substantially. Perhaps a bit more on Italy than here, so I'm sure that you'll still be able to come up with some good comments on this too. Carlo, floor is yours.
Thank you, Renilde, and thanks to Giuseppe and Dan for the opportunity of discussing this excellent piece of work. Actually, when I was asked to act as a discussant, I could clearly see the cons of accepting, which is summarizing and discussing in 15 minutes what is actually a vast amount of papers and research that has been going on. They not only have the story of entrants of exit and zombie firms, but also the work of Giuseppe on barriers to entry, and the work of Dan and Chiara on laggards, and the work of Carlo on employment. I mean, there's a whole bunch of research coming up on firm-level data from the OECD, so it's very tough to, let's say, summarize in particular also the zombie project in a way in 15 minutes. On the pro side, however, the project is super interesting, as you've seen, and it's already quite very well read in the academic community because we have already seen preliminary results. So I was a bit aware, I mean, of their results and the way they were coming out. Also, as Renilde was mentioning, being an Italian is an advantage because clearly Italy is probably the country that has most to gain from the restructuring of zombie firms, as Dan has shown in some of the statistics. So I clearly here have a natural competitive advantage in this. So what I will be discussing essentially is 3 points that touch a number of different papers that they have. And then I will have one last policy comment more on the caveat side. So the 3 points are between academics and policy, and then later on. So the first point I would like to touch upon is what is the nature of the virus behind zombie firms, and why zombie firms emerge? What do we know about that? The second is about the idea that this congestion of zombie firms leads to, and whether and to what extent it leads to the contagion effect, so that also good firms in the end are hampered by the presence of zombie firms, which is, I think, a very interesting point of debate. There's still contrasting views on this. And in general, then, my last point, I will touch upon some of my recent research on putting out a discussion on what we should do to preserve the overall health of the system, and I will touch upon actually here the banking sector and the reform of the banking sector, and take advantage also of the presence of Mario Nava here among us. And then one last caveat. So on point, you probably know this blockbuster movie from Hollywood. It's called World War Z with Brad Pitt acting. It was on zombies, of course, human zombies in this case. But the whole story of the movie was what was the virus causing the zombie disease. No? So the title of the slide comes from this. I mean, and rather than reading the slide that Dan discussed through time, I'm reading it across indicators. And basically, if you look at that, you see that the share of capital and workers that zombie firms have is larger than the share of the zombie firms on the industry, which implies, by definition, that zombie firms tend to be larger, both in capital and labor, than the median firm in the industry. So the zombies are not small firms. The zombies are large, relatively large firms, which creates an interesting political economy problem, because employment is there. So they are all, I mean, holy grails for politicians to touch upon. But I don't want to enter into this discussion here. But let's focus on the fact that zombie firms are larger. So basically, the bottom line is that zombie firms are inefficiently large and therefore over-resourced. So there is clearly misallocation. There is capital going to firms that shouldn't receive capital, and then they grow. So the then question comes is whether this misallocation happens between or within sectors. And from the evidence of their works and also the stuff we have done with the blueprint here at Bruegel, there are a number of hints that this evidence is within industries. Essentially, there are these sort of frontier shocks. There is a nice paper, recent paper now in the making by Fabiano and Gianmarco, a number of Italians actually, on Italy. And basically what we are seeing is that within an industry, there is this technology shock, which can be captured by by some firms and then become frontier firms, and somehow, for a number of characteristics, the other firms are unable, within the same industry, to catch up. Now, these characteristics can be either idiosyncratic to the firm, so family firms, for example, can have more difficulties in catching up because of internal sluggish organizational schemes. I'm working now on this, and it's very fascinating results, as work of John Van Reenen, for example, telling you that how tough it is for firms to have a corporate strategy that say foster restructuring, which is not the case in particular in family firms. Or there can be institutional characteristics. You know, the debt versus capital incentives might be such that you tend to still have bank debt compared to capital, and therefore those firms more exposed to banks would be less likely to be able to catch up with the frontier firms. This is another indication. So my bottom line, however, I want to point out with this first comment is that clearly zombie firm is the pathological outcome of a phenomenon which is laggard firms. I mean, so I would encourage and they are doing in this direction, but in general, policymakers don't think that if I solve the zombie firm problem, then the problem is solved. The zombie firm is just the outcome of firms that are becoming laggards and then gradually becoming zombies. So it's important to keep on doing research on why laggards are taking place and what is hampering this technology catch-up from frontier to laggard firms, and then, of course, cleaning from the outcome that we already see, which is zombie firms. So that's my first comment. The second point is the graph. This is taken directly from the paper. I guess Dan only presented the left-hand side graph. This is essentially the congestion and access to finance to LT firms. So I think it's the work done with Philippos, right, on the ECB safe data. Basically, what they show that there is a correlation between the bank loan availability to good firms and the share of sector capital tied to zombies. Now, I think well, we have to be very clear here. I mean, the evidence that it's here comes, as if I recall correctly, from sectoral differences, okay? So in this piece of work, because of a limitation in the data, essentially what you identify from sectoral differences within each country in a specific year. So contrary to other evidence that Dan has discussed, there's no country times industry fixed effect here. Sorry for the academic, let's say, notation. So it could well be that if a sector is hit by a shock, let's say a textile industry in a given country, in a given year, both zombie firms might be there because they will be put out from the market because of the competition coming from China, but also opportunities for profit could be lower in the same industry, and therefore for a bank it would be more risky to lend to firms in that industry hit by the shock. That creates a natural, let's say, correlation with the presence of zombie firms, but that's not necessarily a causation effect, okay? So that doesn't mean that because there are zombie firms, then banks lend less to the good firms. It might just well be that because a sector has been hit by this idiosyncratic shock that affects both. In fact, there's a paper which also in Italy that says and discusses, although they confirm part of the results, on the other hand, they find a different story. They find that the aggregate effects on multi-factor productivity and the growth of LT firms from zombie firms are minimal according to this evidence. Now, I don't necessarily agree with either one story or the other story. I only suggest here that we do need to have more analysis on what is a potentially very, let's say, important interaction in terms of the causal relation between zombie firms and bank lending. And of course, if we can go on and beyond with the data limitation that currently affects our analysis, that would be a very nice and interesting area of research. Also because if causality can be proven from zombie firms to lending to health firms, that would give us an idea of what are the channels through which restructuring and reallocation takes place within an industry, and therefore this is something that would allow us to not only measure reallocation, but also measure the drivers of reallocation, which is, I think, a very important story. Third point is about the overall health of the system. No, this is the stuff I've been working on. And essentially, I have two facts that I have in the data. This is the Fiji sample, so Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Hungary, Austria, and UK manufacturing. This is one industry in France, and these are firms observed over time. And what you see on the vertical axis is a proxy of access to finance, which is tangible assets over total assets. And what you see on the horizontal axis is the productivity of these firms. So as you can see, there is a lot of heterogeneity. Basically, firms with the same level of productivity within the same industry, within the same country, have a differential access to finance. Okay, and that's a fact. So that points to the fact that banks, since most of these firms, 90% of these firms, use banks as external lending, as is typical in Europe, this points to the fact that banks tend to have an heterogeneous lending function, so to say. They don't lend the same to the same firms, to similar firms, or firms demand differently finance, which is one story or the other. Now, if on the same firms you can compute a structural indicator of credit constraint, you can, in the paper, that's what we do essentially. We derive from a structural theoretical model an indicator of access of credit constraint, implied credit constraint by the firm. So we don't need survey data, basically. We just look at balance sheet data and you can derive out of this an indicator of credit constraint at the firm level. You do realize that this indicator of credit constraint at the firm level correlates negatively with the size of the firm, even controlling for productivity. Essentially, what you see here is the result of the residual of a regression, where I regress the size of the firms on productivity. What is unexplained by productivity still correlates negatively with the indicator of credit constraint, which implies fact number two, that banks tend to lend relatively more to large firms, even controlling for productivity. So not knowing what to do, banks would rather prefer a large firm to a small firms, because somehow he finds it less risky. Okay. So the bottom line is that if you combine all these facts together, there is true a complementarity of insolvency reforms with bank health, which I think is a key message of this study, where we have to think. So it's important to work on the insolvency reforms and on the bank health, because the two go together. But however, it really depends on what you mean and how you define these policy regimes, because if within the same country and industry there is still a differential access to credit of firms for the same level of productivity, and if capital inflows seems to be misallocated towards firms that have a higher net worth rather than higher productivity, which is a finding which for Southern Europe has now also been, although not directly observed, but inferred from calibration of a model by Gita, Gopinath, and co-authors. The bottom line is that you should prevent banks from repeating the same mistakes in a way. No, they have already lent a lot of capital to firms that are now inefficient and are stuck there. You solve the problem now with these insolvency regimes and the reform of bank health and the complementarity between the two, but what tells you that you don't end up with the same problem again in the future? It depends on whether you either reduce the debt bias in the corporate tax system and through the capital market reforms, or if we still believe, and as I probably think, that in the medium term, banks will still be a very strong source of external financing for firms, then the structure, the incentives for banks should be less size dependent and more productivity dependent. I don't know how to do it, but I point to the fact that in the data there is a clear, let's say, bias towards size. And if there is a bias towards size, I can solve the problem of zombie firms today, but in the next crisis I will have the same problem again. And that's the third comment. Now, last caveat. This is a productivity distribution, and here what we have done, we on a sample of European firms that have been working with recently, the one we have discussed a few months ago here in Brussels in Confindustria, what I've played around is with essentially thresholds above which firms have certain winning characteristics, okay? So the seventh decile of the distribution looks like if you are in the top 30% of firms, you are what every policymaker would dream of. You know, you're innovative, you're international, you pay your workers based on incentives, you make lots of money, you grow, whatever. Then there are the followers of these firms. The followers are, if you look at the numbers and the probability that you have as a firm certain characteristics between the median and the seventh decile of the distribution. Then there is a second number of followers, firms that are still below the median productivity but that are trying. And that's between the second and the fifth percentile of the productivity distribution. And then, ideally, there should be the zombie firms. The zombie firms are those in the first two decile of the productivity distribution. But watch out, we are not measuring zombie firms here with productivity. We are measuring it with the interest rates repayment for 3 years between 2007 and 2016, I think, over the last 10 years, yes. And we know that this is a period in which financial constraints and growth of finance to non-financial corporation has been negative. So we have to be very clear that there is an overlap between those who call zombie firms and the first two decile of the productivity distribution. It is likely that there is an overlap, but we have to make sure that what we call zombie firms, since all that matters is that we kill the first part of the productivity, the exit should be in terms of productivity. It could very well be that there is a firm in the green area or even in the blue area that is still a zombie firm because of relationship lending and the head of the bank doesn't like the owner of the firm, and it's a zombie firm, but that firm would actually be able to survive if capital is properly allocated to that firm. And this is a type 2 error that I would like to avoid, frankly, because it's essentially an option that we would be wasting. So there is the baby and there is the dirty water, and we should be able to distinguish between the two clearly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Carlo, I knew that you were going to do a good job, and you've proven that. Really, I think you raised two very important points. Is also look at why we have zombie companies, and particularly also the whole process from lagging companies to zombie firms, I think is a very important point here. Also reminding us that these are not just only small firms, but also indeed larger firms. And also the relationship with productivity, I think definitely is important. We want to understand those that are just lagging behind, but still have the potential to catch up in terms of productivity versus the ones that have a bad management or whatever and really need to exit as well. So I think also for the whole restructuring agenda, that's a very important point. And another very important point you made was that we also need to understand the mechanisms behind what the zombie effect is on aggregate productivity growth here. And for instance, understanding better the extent to which this is misallocation of financial structure here and with zombie banks, I think is very important also for driving the policy agenda. But you clearly raised the stakes in terms of what issues we need to discuss for policies, way broader here, also addressing this generation of zombies and also other mechanisms here. So very good points. And I take it that you need a bit of time to digest on all these answers here. So perhaps we can first go for first round of questions from the floor here. That will give you a bit more time to think about these big questions that you rose here. So can we start the discussion? Who has already a big question? Yeah. Perhaps if you can identify first a bit who you are.
Iñigo Bilbao from the European Commission DG Research. First of all, congratulations to Bruegel and the OECD, and thank you very much for coming here and presenting. We are very avid users of this data, and we are strong believers in the message. Having said that, I have two questions. The first one refers to the size of the problem of the zombie firms. And, we have seen that there has been a rise in numbers of zombie firms in many Southern European countries. And I was wondering to what extent this is due to cyclical factors in terms of the crisis and the fact that many of these companies have been not able to have strong demand, etc., and whether this is actually the numbers that you have in some firms here are related or are mixing a little bit these structural factors of bad management, etc., with cyclical factors, and whether the size of the problem then needs to be recalculated a little bit in that sense. And the second one, and I think that it was already touched upon, the discussion and Reinhilde with the comments, is about, the importance of the zombie firms with the productivity. In your presentation, you made a strong link between the two, but maybe, the zombie firms are just a symptom, and what it is really underlying there, and the policy response to increase the productivity may not be only or mainly due to these zombie firms, but we have to look at the underlying causes, because when you see the number of firms that may be considered as zombie firms with the number of laggard firms, you really see a huge dispersion. So the capital and resources that are being sunk in by these companies may actually go into the other laggard firms, and this may not have a very impactful result on productivity growth in Europe. So maybe the underlying factors are different than this, although it's certainly one of the factors contributing. Thank you.
Good questions. Good questions. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, but maybe you decide to, because you have to walk and minimize your transaction.
Thank you. My name is Stefan Rees from the Netherlands, Perm Rep here in Brussels. First, big compliment to Reinhilde and Breugel for having such a series of events on structural economic policies. I think that we should keep on doing that because the future of Europe discussion is not just about macroeconomics, but about exactly the things that we talk about here today. And of course, thanks to the presenters. It was again fascinating to hear from your results. I want to ask a question which is a bit putting the results of your research in the context of other issues that we discuss here in Brussels around single market, for instance. Taken as a starting point, the slide that you showed in the beginning of the huge difference between manufacturing and services when it is between productivity performance of frontier firms and laggards, where you would think, and I don't think that the rest of the presentation touched on that there would be factors why there is probably a larger share or amount of zombie firms in services than there is in manufacturing, and what lies at the cause of that. Possibly insolvency regimes can work out differently in different sectors. I'd very happily be convinced of that, but I could imagine that there's other issues at stake. For instance, the PMR and OECD. I mean, if there is evidence that on a national level, the level of restrictiveness of services market, for instance, plays a role in there. But of course, in the European context, with the services single market still functioning far less well than in goods, so you could imagine that there is cross-border aspects that we don't capture by looking at national states. You said that the potential benefits within sectors don't take into account cross-sectoral effects. Cross-border effects could make them even larger. So there is, for me, the question to what extent deficiencies in the functioning of the single market actually have to do with zombie firms in Europe and then particularly in services. Thank you.
Yep, very good question. So in view of the Holy Trinity, we take one more question and then for the first round, and then we go. So, yeah.
Hello, Yorgos Petropoulos from Bruegel. Thanks for this nice presentation and very nice discussion too. A quick question. How time consistent is the definition of zombie firms? For example, if a firm is classified as a zombie firm in 2012 due to the crisis and all this financial turmoil, could it be possible that at the recovery period in 2017 is healthy firm and not zombie? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So I think it's time to go for first round of reactions here.
Start with some addressing some general issues. So first of all, thanks to all the people that asked questions, and especially thanks to Carlo for his very thoughtful and thorough discussion of this paper. So let me just first say something about services. Okay, indeed, this is a very relevant issue. We haven't really looked at the differences between the prevalence of zombie firms in manufacturing versus services. Maybe Dan has done it in front of his computer, but it didn't come out of on paper yet. But certainly we have looked at the extent to which the productivity slowdown is related to increasing productivity dispersion in different sectors. And there you see for sure that much of this slowdown originates from services, that there's a much larger gap opening up between frontier firms and laggards in services than elsewhere. And I was here a couple of weeks ago at the Commission presenting some work we've done in the context of the discussion on national productivity boards, and for that presentation, we had computed the kind of charts that we showed at the beginning, focusing on EU countries, because clearly services is a major EU problem. The single market in services is very far from being achieved. And it's, in our view, and in the light of evidence that we have, one of the major causes of differences in productivity growth across, not only across OECD countries, European countries, but also, comparing European and non-European countries. And the problem there is that it's a small market. There are a lot of barriers. Not only in traditional services, but barriers are building up also in digital services. The cross-border data transfer is made increasingly difficult, which is a problem. And so when you look at the delay that laggards are taking over frontier firms in services, it's much larger. And so certainly this puts the need for getting back at the reform agenda in services at the European level in a much closer focus, and it should be.
Perhaps because the question was broader than just manufacturing and services. It was also the importance of product market competition and how strong that actually would be. First of all, explaining why you have so many zombie firms in particular sectors here, and also what the effect is of zombies on the other firms in the sector too, and how strong product market competition is as a disciplining force here.
No, certainly. I mean, one channel through which zombies are kept alive is via bank forbearance and stuff like that. But even a more basic one is that if there's no competition, I mean, there's no incentive for firms to get out of, to exit markets, or to, being forced out of markets, or being forced to restructure. There is a big issue, for instance, with management abilities in many European countries, especially Southern European countries, and managerial abilities depend on the incentives that are put on firms to find better managers and better way to organize production within their firms. So certainly, product market competition is an issue, and especially in some service sectors. And here we have to go a little bit down to a kind of a more detailed level. We know that especially in professional services, for instance, there is a big gap to be filled. There are a lot of resistances to reform these sectors, but this is an area where certainly there is a need for action. So that was the first
complementary policy instrument.
Yeah, absolutely. But to some extent, Dan touched upon this when he showed complementarities between entry barriers, and the impact of changing insolvency regimes and so on. And clearly, entry barriers is one major issue in, for instance, in professional services. So, perhaps Dan can follow up on.
Giuseppe invented the OECD Product Market Regulation Index,
Yes,
so
exactly,
you're talking to the right guy. The only thing I'd add on that is, we do, in one of the underlying papers, we do control for PMR in our regressions, and we do find some evidence that in countries with higher barriers to entry, you do see that there's more capital sunk in zombie firms in those sectors that should be more exposed to that policy. So sectors of naturally higher entry and exit demand. So there is, and in the other work we show that certainly productivity divergence was more marked in those services sectors where the rate of product market reform slowed most. So I think that's a key point. I'll start from the end and work backwards. Just in terms of the first question from the Commission. So this issue of the size of the zombie firm problem, and in particular the impact of cyclical factors versus structural factors, is a recurring question. And certainly Valentine and Muge, who did the heavy lifting on the Walking Dead paper, spent a lot of time basically trying to understand the effect of cyclical factors. I should note that as a starting point, all the analysis where we try to quantify the aggregate impacts of zombie congestion on business investment or capital reallocation control for country times industry times year fixed effects. So it sweeps out country-specific cyclical shocks within a given industry. So in the econometrics, that's taken out. We're also very careful, for instance, to drop Southern European countries where you'd expect this problem to be most severe, so Italy and Spain, and the results are robust to that. We do regressions in the pre-crisis period, and you see that basically the coefficients in terms of the size of the impact of zombie congestion on business investment and non-zombies is very similar. So, but obviously in the post-crisis period, the macro shares of zombies do rise, but when we get down to the actual econometric estimation, we're very careful to try to sweep out those effects. So clearly any kind of country level chart is going to have some effect of the cycle in, but when we identify this in terms of econometrics, we control for that. Just in terms of the time consistency of the definition. So you mentioned 2012 versus 2017. Our database, when we did this analysis, ran up to 2013. We now have a new cut of Orbis, which is 2014 and 2015 data. We haven't been able to sort of update the analysis yet, but I know that the Bank of International Settlements in their last quarterly review replicated this analysis on listed firms for data up until 2015, and they showed that the zombie firm share continued to rise in a number of countries. So in a sense, this is one of the big questions here or quandaries is, we know that creative recessions are often a time for creative destruction. And we saw the zombie capital share rise during recessions, but then it continued to rise afterwards as well. And just coming back to Carlo's point, his final point about, so insolvency reform may pay dividends now in terms of reducing zombie congestion, but what about for the next crisis? And I think I'd push back on that idea a little bit. I don't know if we can go backwards in your slides at all. Is that possible?
Depends on...
Okay, so the UK is a really interesting case. We see that based on our indicators, the UK has essentially the best insolvency regime in the OECD. When you see basically that when the crisis hits, basically the zombie share in the UK actually declines, which I think is significant. In countries that have inferior insolvency regimes, you see big increases. So, I think you can also think of insolvency regimes as almost being like a macro-prudential tool as well, in a sense. So, in terms of the other comments, so I really liked your point about the idea of zombie firms being a pathological outcome of laggard firms. And I would also add that it's almost a pathological outcome of misallocation as well. So, I think one of the things in the study that we were careful to do was to try demonstrate the implications of insolvency reform, not only for reducing zombie congestion, but also targeting those other sources of productivity weakness. So, for instance, the catch-up of laggard firms to the global frontier, the extent to which capital is misallocated across different firms. So, I agree that basically this is just a small part or a more intense part of a wider problem, and certainly more research on the laggard firm issue is key. In terms of the...
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
So it's not just only knowing where exactly in the distribution the zombie firms are, but also for the contagion effect. I think it may matter too. Is the contagion effect stronger on the average firms, but or also on the top firms here? Because you show that the top firms keep on pushing ahead. Would that mean that these top firms are less sensitive to the presence of zombie firms? Well, because, for instance, they don't need the resources that get trapped into zombies. They can
it's actually the opposite.
grow without.
So what we show is that it's actually firms of greater than average productivity whose growth is constrained by basically the persistence of zombie firms. So, there's a...
So what you're saying is that they could actually have forged ahead even further.
Well, in terms of their, obviously the divergence chart is about within firm productivity. In terms of their relative size, they could have increased more in terms of the extent to which resources flow. Their weight in the economy would have increased in a counterfactual sense. It would have meant growth would have been higher from an aggregate perspective than otherwise, in a sense.
What they show is that it's mostly young and innovative firms that suffer from the presence of zombies. At least this is what comes out of the medical analysis.
Yeah. And just the final thing, so you mentioned the Scavati paper for Italy, which we've had a lot of contact with Italy on this, and that's probably an understatement. It's a great paper, and they've got awesome data, and I think it's a really interesting framework. Let me just say a couple of things. So I think we're coming from this issue from a broader perspective. So they very much focus on the bank-firm link. We're interested in a number of reasons why zombie firms can survive, not just the forbearance issue. So we're also interested in the direct effects of weak structural policy as well. So, to the extent that they focus on just the bank-firm link, I think they're only getting at a fraction of the issue, if you like. The other thing is that when you dig deeper into the idea of forbearance, my recollection, and Philippos can correct me if I'm wrong, is that they focus on the allocation of new lending. Yeah. And there's a sense that the forbearance problem in Europe is also about the stock of existing lending. So these are things like repayment holidays and so forth. And so in the paper on breaking the shackles of Philippos, what we do is we focus on a broader measure of bank health, and we think that may be also able to get at kind of this issue of the stock. So the fact that a bank can not only engage in forbearance by extending a new loan to a firm, but basically affecting the repayment conditions of the existing debt. And finally, by focusing purely on the bank-firm link, I think they're also abstracting from the effect on healthy firms of the general impact of zombie congestion on market profitability. So you can imagine that if zombie congestion basically pushes down prices, elevates wages, reduces market profitability, then you can imagine that healthy firms would have let fewer good projects to go to a bank to ask credit for, in a sense. So I think it's a great paper, and I think there's actually a lot of complementarities between both work, but I think also we're thinking about other elements of this issue as well. But I do agree that more work on this is just essential. So,
in fact, if I can just follow up on this, the point is that correctly, as you said, you have a much more general story, and you have a clear identification on because you have country, time industry, and time fixed effect in the effects on productivity and in the effects on capital allocation, which I find interesting because clearly there is an effect there, and I might be inclined in believing that it's harder to claim that it's just correlation due to spurious effects, and therefore it's worth exploring. Then when one channel is credit, so the idea that the effect goes through the banking system that is affected by firms, Fabiano is telling you that, yes, there is evidence on the bank, but that doesn't translate into the aggregate picture because maybe they're just looking at new. I agree that the stock is crucial, the new lending is just a fraction of it. And then you instead say that it's actually one of the channel, but then the point is that there is this technical gap in identification in your story that you are between sectors rather than within sectors because of data limitations. So here, this point is where I would really like to dig deeper and you know, try to do more work on this.
Absolutely. I mean, when we use the SAFE survey, it's for 4 countries. We have a lot fewer observations.
But,
so,
I mean,
but we accept that.
Yeah.
So we're almost at the end, but I'd like to go for one more round of very quick questions. How many do we still have? 2. But really try to be very concise in your question because we're running out of time.
My name is Benjamin Hageloch. I'm assistant in the European Parliament, and I have maybe one comment or some more ideas on it, and the question as a follow-up. So first of all, if I understood it correctly, you identify those zombie firms in a way. How much do they create? Sorry, I kind of lost it. My problem is when you define it on the interest that those companies create. In which way is this linked to the interest rates that the central banks ask for or that the central banks provide? For example, if the central bank sets the interest rates very low, does this also mean that when companies only create this very small interest rate that they can still survive? And could this, in the long run, kind of limit competition and in that way, in the end, lead to effects that the central bank doesn't want? That was I'll be very, very fast. A second idea is when we have these effects on zombie companies, do we always also have the same effect on the zombie states that we kind of created in the EU? Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Fair questions. Just. Yeah.
Hi, Nicola Filippone from the European Commission. I had a question about the focus you put on insolvency reform. When I look at the various indicators that you have for your index, they focus a lot on restructuring, early warning, and rehabilitation. Something which is in a sense very close to the directive, that was proposal for a directive by the Commission, but which does not seem to tackle the ability of the insolvency system to actually wipe out the non-viable firms. And basically what you want to ensure is that when you get into liquidation, that is something which is done very quickly. And all the zombie firm, in a sense, belong to the grave. And so you would like to have an indicator telling you to what extent the insolvency system is able to put them in the grave. And I'm not sure to what extent this is something that you measure.
Yep. Yep. So sorting out better the bad from the... Okay, that's the last question.
Thank you very much. Very impressive paper, and also very multidimensional how you tackle the issue. Andris Krasniņš, DG Employment, on the active labor market policies, and you said that you controlled for the cycle of development, but still, let's say we have still an issue with unemployment, particularly in Greece, and letting of those non-productive firms go out of the business of zombie firms. It's not given that those people would be rehired through active labor market policies, because you can train them all you want, but if there are no jobs, they would hardly start any new businesses. And being low productivity is still better than no productivity at all for overall economy. And what is your thinking on this area?
Yeah. Okay. So a few more cyclical. Can we have a quick answer?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So just let me address the first question, which was, if I understand correctly, about another possible channel of keeping the zombie firms alive, which is by having easy monetary policies, right? Mm-hmm. This is certainly it's a fascinating issue, which of course goes back before the crisis, and could indeed explain some of the misallocation that was observed before the crisis. It became even stronger during the crisis with quantitative easing and unconventional monetary policy and so on. Of course, these policies had a reason. So at best, the question is that whether there were kind of undesired side effects which haven't been taken into account sufficiently. But it's still, it is a very relevant issue. There are various channels through which this kind of easy money can be related to the productivity slowdown. One is perhaps by reducing the opportunity cost of lending to zombie firms. Another one is by giving more incentives to investors to look for high yield returns, which may be, for instance, related to issuance of bonds by firms that are not necessarily the highest productive ones, and so on. This is, as I say, it's a fascinating issue. It's a very broad issue. It opens up a whole set of other, questions, and I don't think we can exhaust it here. But I will point out that we are working on it, and that there will be in January a conference organized jointly with the BIS and the IMF, which is devoted expressly to that. I will leave some copies of this. This is co-sponsored by the Global Forum on Productivity. So I will leave here a couple of copies of this folder in which you'll find information about that. It's on the 10th and 11th of January, and we have a lot of papers dealing with precisely this set of issues.
Okay. So, thank you very much. That's a good way to end the discussion here, to say that there is still quite a lot on the research agenda here. That's not to say that the work that you've been doing is really very great. He already helps quite a lot to push the discussion at a much higher evidence-based level here. But I think the many questions also already identified that this is continuing work here that needs to be continued here, and here at